Alrighty, welcome back to another podcast hosted by Exercises Medicine at UC San Diego, where we emphasize raising awareness of exercise for health and well-being, alongside advancing professional development in the diverse careers of sports medicine.
And just a little disclaimer before we start, we are not medical or fitness professionals, and the info we discussed today is just for entertainment purposes and as such is not to be misconstrued as medical advice. I am one of the professional development coordinators at Exercise Medicine, and Katya is one of the professional development members, and we will be hosting today's informational interview.
Today we get to speak to Miss Kate Allgood, so welcome, a current sports psychology consultant and coach and owner of Quantum Performance in San Diego. Thank you for joining us today. Can you please introduce yourself and tell your listeners a little bit about your professional experience before we get started with our other questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I do sports psychology consulting and coaching. And so what that means is I work with mainly athletes of all ages and skill levels on the mental side to their performance. So dealing with, things around confidence, maybe anxiety, routines, behaviors, focus. Really, the way I like to sometimes describe it is kind of all those intangible factors that can impact the tangible performance of the athlete. So the things you can't see or touch is really kind of what I work with. I also do work with some people in the military, law enforcement, as well as business, because really the principles are about helping someone to be able to perform at their very best. Depending on that context, that will be changed a little bit, but really helping them on that mental side so that they can really maximize their potential and really learn what it's going to take for them to, be able to do so on the mental side of the equation.
Oh, wow, nice. And just curious, what initially influenced you to become a sports psychologist?
So for me, I'm originally from Canada, and I was a pretty high level ice hockey player. So I played in college, played a couple of years professionally. Was actually in the selection pool for the 2010 Olympics. So was pegged by the government as a potential candidate. And so, being obviously a high level athlete, I understand and have, in one sense, been in the trenches of a lot of my clients, understanding the psychological implications of being one of the best, of, trying to pursue something. And so I've always wanted to get into the world of sports as a career. I knew that it looked very different when I was a teenager. Even when I was in my undergrad, as you're, young and trying to figure out what that's going to look like for yourself. And, so it was everything from a sports agent to, gym teacher, to maybe working more on the physical side of working with athletes. And eventually I kind of started to realize, after undergrad and graduating and doing some work on the physical side with athletes, that really my passion was within the field of psychology. And so kind of it helped me merge my two passions of, sports and then, psychology. And it's something I'm very passionate about.
So you talk about your undergraduate degree. So what kind of classes did you take to kind of get your influence in the sports psychology field?
Yeah, so I took quite a wide variety of classes in my undergrad, right, which is obviously usually the purpose of undergrad, to give you a good sense of the different branches of psychology and what that looks like. And so I did take about 2, maybe 3 sports psychology classes in my undergrad, but I took, as I said, a lot of other things, general psychology, cognitive behavioral, positive psychology, abnormal psych, childhood development classes, social psychology. So I think that's important because you need to, one, even if you are, going into the field of sports psychology, it's good to understand other components, right? Obviously, an athlete has so many other components besides who they are as an athlete. And so I think also then personally, it's important to see where it might fit for you, right? There's so many branches in the field of psychology. And even back when I was in undergrad, I don't know, sports psychology had been around, but it wasn't maybe such a mainstream actual career. It was kind of usually people, therapists who were doing other things who kind of, worked with some athletes. So I don't even know if it was fully in my scope that could be my main profession. So it's just about taking as many as possible. And I think also the school requires that, right, to be able to take as many different things as possible.
Do you have any personal favorite undergrad psychology class you took in college?
Social psychology actually was my favorite.
Oh, really?
I really like social psychology, and I think part of it was my professor. She was fantastic. The professor I had for social psychology, she was one of those professors. She actually knew all our names, even in the lecture. Now, when I took social psychology, I was actually at a school in the States, and it was a smaller school, so there wasn't as many students in even the lecture. So, for her to be able to like call your name, she even proofread one of my papers before I handed it to her, the final version. Wow. So she was very hands-on. But I also love, I think everyone does, understanding how people operate in a social context, like why opposites attract, or bystander effect, like why someone might not help out in a situation. But that was definitely probably my favorite course.
That must be so nice. Katya and I go to UCSD and the lecturers are like 400 people. My physics class is like 1,000 people. It's impossible to even get to like talk to the professor. So that's really nice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, because I split my time. So I did go back to a school in Canada. It was more similar to that, where it was like 400 in my undergrad, intro to psych class. And so even just getting the TAs a time was difficult. So
yeah,
I was very, very fortunate. Yeah, for that year to have that. It was pretty special.
Yeah. And earlier you were talking a little bit about the Winter Olympics and how you're like a contender for that. And personally, I'm like a huge fan of the Olympics. I love watching the Olympics and all of that. So I was wondering if you could like give us a little, I know this is a little bit off topic, but can you give us a little bit like insight or a little bit of details of what that process was like training for the Olympics or like becoming even a contender for the Olympics?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, obviously every sport is different with what that looks like. And I retired a couple of years out from the 2010 Olympics, which was the one I was kind of gearing for. For where I come from, it was really like, the government and the Hockey Canada will kind of, I guess, select you or just like tap you on the shoulder, so to speak, in terms of like saying like you're someone that we're interested in. Obviously, the scouts are there at all your games, or not all, but a lot of the games. And then for us, the government was giving money to those who had been kind of tapped as a potential candidate to help with training and help, pay for some of those things that obviously, as an Olympic athlete, a lot of time that's difficult to do because you generally are not being paid, right? You're amateur athletes. So for me, because it was happening while I was in undergrad, it didn't look too different, where I just, I had to go to my practices, go to my games, people were there watching me. And then obviously as you get closer, you get, selected to their selection camps that you go to. And then they obviously look at you there. And eventually if you or continue going on, there's like an Olympic kind of training camp that's centralized. So in Canada, they take, I don't know exactly, it might have been the 40 people the year before the Olympics, and they centralize you somewhere and you do all your training and everything together, and then they slowly whittle you down. I didn't get to that point. I kind of walked away before that, but that's generally the process of how it looks like.
So you were balancing training for the Olympics and you were undergrad at the same time?
Yeah, I guess it's not that much different than the student athletes at the school that you guys go to, right? Like it's your kind of training, but you're still just doing your sport. Like I was, you just have your regular practices with your team, and hockey looks a little bit different than maybe some other sports look, where obviously a lot of that training comes in during the year, and then in the off season, you're doing a lot of that, what we call off ice training, which takes up a good amount of time. But that's part of it is, in the summertime, I wasn't going to school, right? So that left a lot of time to be able to train. And, if the government's giving you some money that, I didn't need to get a summer job then, right? So that now opens the door to be able to train. And that's the whole purpose, right? To help people not have to get jobs so you can spend all that extra time that you do have to be able to train while you're doing that. And it's a balancing act, but, you might take a class less or two here or there just to help with that balancing act, but it is a balancing act.
Right. So how did you prioritize your like personal well-being through all of this, through all of the things that you needed to do and all the stress of training and all these things? And
yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it's something, if I'd known a lot of stuff I knew now, maybe I would have even done a better job. But I think there was a few things as I look back that I did do. As I mentioned earlier, I went for a year to a school in upstate New York. And I ended up going back to my university that I started with in Canada for a little bit of that kind of well-being for myself. It allowed me to be closer to Toronto, where I was from, when I had my kind of support system there. So I had, someone who was helping me through my mental struggles there that I could see and work with. And then, people there who I was working with to help me physically, kind of heal from some injuries and, just helped to keep my body where it needed to be able to go through that grind of training and playing. And then I was very, very fortunate that in the summertime, I did not have to get a job, right? So I really got a break in terms of that component. And I'm fortunate my family had what we say in Canada is called a cottage, which is right on the water up in north of Toronto. So I got to spend my summers up there just training and kind of getting away from the city, getting away from the pressure of being an athlete, and just kind of focus on just, kind of rejuvenating, resetting and getting ready for the next school year, where it's a grind where you start in September, go all the way through to end of February, sometimes middle of March, with balancing both. And then you kind of have to reset yourself. So I was fortunate where I got a few of those natural things to help me kind of, be able to balance it all. But I know a lot of people who do not do that. So yeah, it is a necessity though.
Right. So is there anything you would have changed knowing everything you know now as a sports psychologist? Like maybe something you would have told yourself as an undergrad, or any tips that you would have given yourself?
I think, understanding and preparing for the point in the year where it was getting more difficult, like generally, things were good through probably just before Christmas, December. It'd only been like 3.5 months of balancing and the grind. But I definitely noticed come January, February, like it was mentally a lot more difficult for me that at that point where like things were really, it had been a long time of balancing both. And so I think I just wasn't as prepared for that part of the year. And so looking at, okay, how do I, spend a little more time, maybe, taking care of myself, making sure that I am finding that, I would say balance, because it's a hard thing in that time of year to be balanced, but to, find those moments to take care of myself and to know that this is, the tough part of the year. A lot of the time you just get consumed with it and don't see an end or don't know what's going on. And so, that's something I think looking back, it would have been helpful if I had, been a little bit more conscious of that time of year and some things I could have done to maybe help myself during that time.
Definitely need a lot of perseverance to go into any health professional related field.
Yeah.
Just curious, what does a typical day on the job look like for you as a sports psychologist?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. One of the things I do like is there almost in one sense isn't a typical day. It does vary because it really depended on my client's schedule and then when they fit in. But I can start anywhere from seeing a few clients in the morning, 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And then usually I see my last client, 5 or 6, but I'm not going through the entire day of seeing clients. That's not like an 8-hour or 9-hour day. For my field, that's pretty hard because you have to be quite present when you're with a client. So for me, it's a balancing of seeing my clients and then doing, because I own a business, kind of that administrative side to the equation, marketing side to the equation. And then there's also times where I have to use that time for my own learning, my own growth, development, right? Reading books, continually to learn, make sure I stay on top of, my own skill set and everything like that. So it's kind of a balancing, but it's nice because every day doesn't look the same and every Tuesday doesn't look the same. So for me, it's kind of nice where there's a routine, but it also varies. So it's not the same thing every single time. And then, so it's just finding that ability. Obviously my clients, are the first thing that gets fit into my schedule. And then I kind of figure out where I'm going to fit, everything else in there.
And so do you usually treat athletes? And I know this might be like a dumb question, but how does sports psychology differ from like other practices, other psychology related practices?
Yeah, so primarily I see athletes, but no, I have worked with people in the military. I've worked with Navy SEALs. I've worked with doctors. I've worked with law enforcement, so people in the police force here in San Diego. I have worked with a few business individuals as well. Really, it's looking for anybody who's looking for that high performance and doing that through developing mental skill sets. But obviously, yes, sports psychology, generally, it's going to be majority of the time it will be athletes that come find me and see me. And then within that, it's a wide variety. I've worked with 10-year-olds and then, go all the way up through high school, college athletes, Olympic athletes, and professional athletes. So I kind of look at all different sports, all different skill sets, all different ages. And then, so how sports psychology differs from other, areas is my job is 100% on, in terms of, I said, like performance component, like what's going to help someone to maximize the potential in their performance for whatever it is that they're doing. So for an athlete, obviously, on the field or in the competition or in practices, dealing with those mental components that can get in the way, that can be blockers, or they just haven't developed. So a lot of the time athletes will, just focus on their physical skill set and technical skill set without ever really, deliberately or purposely practicing or developing the mental skill set. So obviously there are people who come see me not because anything's wrong, just more because they know that they need to, in order to, as I said, maximize that potential that they have within them, they need to practice and to look to develop that mental side to the equation. Where, if you look at like a clinical psychologist, that's more, sometimes diagnosing, mental illness. Sports psychology is more on the side of mental health, where we're not going to, diagnose, or we're not going to treat, severe depression or severe anxiety or OCD or eating disorders or alcoholism, or anything like that. And then obviously like a marriage and family therapist obviously focuses more in on, marriage and family therapy and dealing with, couples and maybe children of those couples, and everything like that. And then obviously there's a wide variety of other, areas of psychology. But as I said, our main focus is performance, and not diving into those other components unless you have the training. There are some people who have the training in multiple, obviously avenues of psychology.
So what would you say the specific skills or like characteristics that you have found to be the most like helpful for your job and like treating different patients and like kind of their struggles and their obstacles that they need to overcome?
Yeah, so I think obviously a big one is empathy, right? You need to be able to empathize with the person who's sitting across from you. Now, I'm fortunate because of my athletic background. I've been in a lot of the situations my clients are have been in or feel. So it is obviously a little bit easier for me to empathize because of that, and to be able to, put myself in their shoes, because I have been in their shoes before, and know how they're feeling. But that empathy is, really important to feel heard. The client needs to, be able to feel like they're heard, and that they're, the thing that they're feeling or thinking about is not, that they're not alone, that it's not bad, that like this is a part of being human, part of being an athlete, part of, that process, and that someone's there to help them. Listening is obviously a really big skill set, active listening. And, I think also being able to ask good questions, right? That's really a big thing, is to, I can't instill in somebody anything. I can't give them motivation, but I can help ask, good questions that help to maybe pull that out of them. Maybe give them a little bit of insight, but there's a need to more help to pull out of the person what's going on, and that comes through good questions, helping them to think about things in a certain way that they maybe haven't thought about, and just obviously really being able to be there. And then I think another one is not to project my own biases onto someone, and that's obviously always very hard, as in any field of psychology, right? Like to be able to sit there and not project how I might handle or how I might feel, or what I think might be the solution, and just really listen and help to pull that out of them.
So, sorry, go ahead.
You can go. No, you can go.
Well, I was thinking about what we were saying about like having the like personal relationship with like you and the client. So does this differ with like the advice that you give, or kind of like direction that you would give them, like advice, like cater towards the specific athlete in general, or is it the same?
So I think, if I'm understanding your question, is it same information each client, or does it differ because of the differences of that client? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, so there's definitely a mix. Like there's obviously some very, I would say, basic principles and things that people need to be able to have and do on the mental side to be, good athletes. But obviously how it might look for each person, or which ones might be more important for each person, definitely gets influenced by their personality, by their characteristics. And that is, so you do have to take the person into account, as well as the sport into account, as well as the age into account. Like what are they going to be able to do based off of their age, or just comprehend, or how simplified do you need to make it for them? But you do have to take in those individual differences. But as I said, there are some things that, kind of are across the board for each person. So then there's a little bit sometimes of that, repetition a little bit on that side. But obviously a big part of my work too is just helping to listen and help people be able to have a venue to talk about things and to, work through things. So that's obviously very unique and very different for each person. How, I could have 10 athletes of the exact same sport, same issue, but the, psychological components that lead into that, display of that thing could be very different. So that's where, again, those individual differences come in.
Right. So is there a specific age group that you work with, or do you work with clients of like different ages?
Yeah, no, different ages and different skill sets in different sports. So I've worked with, clients as young as 9, 10 years old, and then all the way up to, older athletes and Olympic professional athletes. So, really, obviously, if they're on that younger end of the equation, if they're 9, 10, 11 years old, I do, as I do with all my clients, I do an initial assessment. But especially with those guys, I need to make sure that they're kind of mature enough to really get something out of the work, and, that they're going to be, able to, sit there and talk to me and, as I said, like be invested and get something out of it at that age. So, but, the interesting thing is I've worked with, kids as 13, 14 who are very, invested and very, I don't want to say mature, but they're just, they understand it and they're there and they come with questions and they're very engaged in the process. And so that's really what I'm looking for is, what someone's engagement is in the process and interest in investing in themselves and developing this side to themselves. So whether they're, 13 or 23 or 33, that doesn't matter so much to me, but if they're invested in it.
So how do you work with someone who isn't maybe say like as engaged as you would like, or that is as easy to like maybe talk to, or?
Yeah, that's definitely can be sometimes the challenge sometimes, right? When someone isn't as engaged in the process, and so I have to do a little bit more leading of the direction of the session or where we're going, and sometimes it does feel like I'm just kind of, talking to someone who's not really paying attention or not really getting it, or and so that's, for me, that's my work on my patients to not get too frustrated and, to understand everyone is where they are. Right. And so even if they're not as engaged or invested as maybe I would want, doesn't mean they're not getting anything out of the process. And that's just where they're at in their development. And they're probably getting something out of it, else they wouldn't be there. Right. Else they would not be, sitting across from me. But it's definitely also something as I've gotten older and, had more experience in my practice, I am a little bit more picky with that. And in one sense, my process that I do with incoming potential clients kind of helps weed out, people who may not be as engaged or as invested. So I have put things in place to make sure someone is at least at a certain level of engagement and investment in the process.
Oh, so to my understanding, if someone isn't as like motivated to like get better or like to receive help, you like reject them, or like you or how does that work? Like you just tell them you can't work with them, or yeah.
Yeah, I've actually never been where, I've come close to having to say that sometimes, but no, I usually find the person just doesn't move forward themselves, like of their own. They just make a decision, just because of the way I've structured it. There is a high level of commitment and engagement. And I'm very, as I said, like I have everyone start off with that initial assessment. So I go through what that will look like. And I'm very clear on what it will look like to work with me. And I have policies and procedures in place. And it said it is a commitment. I'm more of a program-based approach. So when you're moving beyond the initial assessment, you have to be, ready to engage and invest. Now, it's not perfect. Like I've had people who, haven't fully completed their programs, and that's their choice, obviously. But I find that usually there's just this natural parting of ways. If I've been working with someone and I'm just feeling like, okay, I think it's, it's time for us because they're not fully engaged. I think they also feel it at the same time. But yeah, at some point that might be something I might have to do is, to sit there with someone and say, hey, like, I think we need to take a little bit of a break because you're not quite as engaged as you need to be. And when you're ready, come back and we'll continue on. Because obviously, you want somebody to get the, something out of this work with me.
Oh, and going back to like the patient to patient kind of interaction, I was wondering if you have any memorable experiences as a sports psychologist.
Oh, that's a hard one because a lot of it's done in the office, right? So there's not too many memorable things. Now, obviously, I do work with the professional team, so I do get to go to their practices and their games, and for me, that's that's memorable just because that's been part of my goal since I started, and it's to get back to that level of. As I said, it doesn't matter if they are professional, it does make it more of a meaningful experience. But, for me, that's kind of fun because that's where it's like full circle, kind of coming back to where I was as an athlete myself. And, so that's always fun and that's different, which changes it up, right? Rather than just sitting in my own office, getting to go and, kind of be there in the environment of the athletes, which is kind of fun, and to feel like you're part of a team again, which is a lot of fun.
And it's kind of like a random question, but have you ever treated like an Olympic medalist athlete?
I haven't treated yet anybody who has won an Olympic medal. I've treated athletes who've won medals in other big international competitions that are leading up to Olympics. Now I do have, a couple clients that are aiming for this upcoming Olympics in the summer. So who knows, maybe that will change, which would be fun. But no one to date yet who's won an Olympic medal.
Oh, I see.
That's so interesting. That's really cool that you get to work with those types of athletes too, though. Well, I suppose you were kind of one of those too. Yeah. So what would you say like the pros and cons of being like a sports psychologist in general would be, or like maybe pros and cons for you specifically?
The pros are definitely, obviously getting to do something I love to do and to know I'm making an impact on somebody beyond even just their sport, to especially have worked with some high school athletes and to know, through their comments to me that I've made a lasting impression and a lasting impact on their lives and helping them to rethink things, to change who they are and to, for some of them, be able to go off to college and not have that anxiety to feel like they can manage things and not like completely unravel when they go to college. To kind of move into being functioning adults, which is pretty neat, whether they're continuing with their sport or not, to be able to apply that to maybe becoming a doctor or, something else and to know I had an impact, on that. I think that's a huge pro. I don't want to say there's any like massive cons because I really do love what I do. Obviously there are challenges with everything that we do in any profession. Some of those challenges sometimes are dealing with parents, right? If I am working with a younger athlete, I've had, a few, angry emails or encounters with parents. And, usually it's just, again, it's emotions and it's, it's worked itself out, but that can obviously be a part of it in that sense where, emotions are high or, they care a lot or they don't understand. So, that can be a challenge. One of the things that I do like, but it's also a challenge is just sports psychology, mental performance. It's gaining traction, and it's definitely we're in a time where it's a lot more prevalent and evident. But there's still challenges around that. A lot of people who feel like it is, a priority still don't make it a priority, and so it's a fascinating thing where everyone understands the mental side is such a huge component. But when it comes down to it, everyone still looks to the physical, components to the equation. I think that will change eventually, but there's still, a challenge around that, and I have to do, push against that a little bit and sometimes not get to do as much maybe as I'd like to, or people kind of fade off. Sometimes that can be frustrating when a client's making good progress and then they kind of decide to go do more physical things and you're like, we're right there. And to go do that, but again, those are just challenges, but it's part of what makes it fun too and keeps me on my toes.
I'm just curious, but you just mentioned how sometimes dealing with like parents can be like a downside. How do you react or how do you deal with parents in those situations? Because I hear so many times from like health professionals how dealing with like irate parents is like a huge downside of being a health professional. So how do you personally like react and how do you deal with managing that situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not a huge downside. It's just a challenge, right? Because there's just sometimes miscommunication and, sometimes how the parent sees it and how the the kid or, feels it or what I'm seeing, right? So a big one is I always like when I first read, I have to give it some space so I don't emotionally react. I mean, that's a big one, right? If someone's coming at me pretty strong, I need to like take a step back and kind of just let it be. And let's like really look at what they're saying and maybe why they're saying, because a lot of the time there is miscommunication where I might get one parent who's coming at me and then the other parent, calls me or emails me, be like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm not sure where that person's coming from, right? Where their husband or wife is coming from. And I've had another one where they didn't have all the information. Their kid was, over the age of 18. So that obviously now means that there's the confidentiality component, right? And so I can't say anything to the parents specifically, and they didn't know what was going on, even though they're paying for it. And so that's where you have to just be delicate and just, it was a misinformation where the kid wasn't maybe explaining something, and it all worked itself out and everything like that. When I just explained, like, this is what's been, not without breaching confidentiality, but this is, I think there's some misunderstanding because I'm not sure what you're commenting on, and there's some confusion here. And so I think that's just a big thing, because again, when they're coming at me, it's their emotions, right? And so you have to kind of let those emotions, push those aside and try and just look really like what's really going on. What are they trying to say? Like, how do we, if I come at them with emotions, that's just going to escalate it. So usually I've been pretty good at just, not letting my emotions kick in and just, respond to them when I've I'm clear-headed myself.
And I know you touched upon this a little bit earlier or throughout the podcast, but I was wondering what kind of skills or characteristics do you think are key in being a sports psychologist?
So kind of the same as like I said, I think obviously empathy, listening, being able to ask good questions, not, projecting your biases onto, somebody else, really being able to try and be a little bit of a blank slate, which is hard. I mean, we all have biases, right? And we're all human, so I can't completely get rid of that. But I think those are probably, some of the top components when you're looking at just being able to be there and understand the person and make them feel heard and, help ask questions and being able to pull that out of them to really help them be the facilitator of their own, growth and development.
So when you were an undergraduate student, did you take advantage of any like internships or anything outside of the classes that you took at school for to become like a sports psychologist or anything?
Yeah, I took advantage of a couple of things, not actually specific to sports psychology, because when I was in undergrad, I didn't know I wanted to do sports psychology as a profession. But I at that time actually was kind of hovering around potentially being a teacher and then doing a gym teacher. So I was fortunate that the school I had gone to for high school allowed me to come in. I think it was about two summers, not full summers, but obviously because they're not in school but when I finished school for about a month and a half. To go in and just kind of, shadow the gym teachers and be in that environment and see what it was really like to be a gym teacher. And it helped me to know that that's not what I wanted to do, which is not a bad thing. I think sometimes that's good, is that sometimes you got to put yourself in a position to find out if this is something you really want to do or not do. And I think that's always good, is when you can weed out something and then it makes you have to rethink. And that obviously now opened the door for me to rethink, okay, that's not what I wanted to do. What's potentially next for me? So I took advantage of that opportunity, which I think obviously ultimately helped me get to where I am right now with my profession.
And to my understanding, you created your own business, correct? Quantum
That's correct.
Performance.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about like how and why you decided to start your own business in sports psychology?
Yeah, so part of it is I'd already started my business before I got into sports psychology, doing something called muscle activation techniques, which is more on the physical side of, biomechanics side of the equation. And one of the reasons I had done that is because there really wasn't any job opportunities. Like most people who do that have to start their own business because there just wasn't really any job opportunities for that. And then the same, so it was just I basically transitioned and morphed my practice to do the sports psychology when I had gone through school, and I'd been certified in sports hypnosis. And same thing, like there are opportunities now more and more for sports psychologists to be hired by professional teams or colleges. But when I was kind of going through, that wasn't a big thing, right? Like usually you'd have to be maybe a professor at a school who this was something you were doing, and then you'd be working with the teams and stuff like that. So it was almost kind of like, in order to make this a full-time job, I had to kind of create that job for myself. And so, I kind of fell into it that way. Now looking back, I think it's the best path for me. I do much better, as an entrepreneur and, kind of running my own business. And this is a much better fit than for me, maybe being an employee somewhere. So it ended up working out, but yeah, it was kind of out of almost like a necessity, and how I'd already started, out of undergrad. I started right off the bat being an entrepreneur and starting my own business. So it just kind of happened that way.
That's super impressive that you were able to do that.
So, wasn't without its challenges.
Oh, I'm sure you probably ran into so many, but I mean, so just before we close off this episode, do you have any tips for anyone that is aspiring to be a sports psychologist, such as yourself?
Yeah, I think a big thing is always to get in front of, if you're not already involved in, athletes' lives. If you are an athlete, great. I don't think you need to necessarily do too much more. Like if you're an undergrad and you're a student athlete, like that's in one sense preparing you quite well for potentially doing it, because you're already in that environment. You're already dealing with your own, maybe mental things. But if you're not, then I think you need to, look, and it's hard right now, obviously with COVID and everything, but to be involved with, a youth sports team, like just to get around, athletes and seeing how they operate and seeing what a team environment looks like, seeing what some of those mental struggles are. You don't have to necessarily be coaching them on the mental side. You could be doing other things, but just being in that environment and making those connections and, starting to be able to observe things. So if you do start to go into your graduate work and doing sports psychology, then you can start to see some of these things more clearly, see how they might apply, and all of that kind of stuff. So definitely, being involved in some way in the world of athletics before you even, step into it is always very good.
Thank you for sharing. So as we finish up, I'd just like to say thank you to Ms. Allgood for spending some time with us and spending time with Exercises Medicine at UCSD and educating us on your professional career. We definitely learned a lot through this podcast in and of itself. For more updates, find Exercises Medicine at UCSD on Facebook and Instagram, or view our past podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music. And have a great weekend, and thanks for listening, guys.
Bye, thank you.